In order to resolve this issue, Luo Binghe employed a method that involved looking for human vessels. When the moon was full, he'd search for someone with strong spiritual energy and pass the excess demonic qi in his body to them. In exchange, he absorbed the greater part of the vessel's spiritual qi. In this way, he naturally regained his balance. However, because Luo Binghe's demonic qi was far too intense, the human vessel would often be left crippled by the energy transfer. Generally speaking, these extraction implements were limited to a single use. And of course, Luo Binghe wouldn't do the demanding work of capturing human vessels himself. Naturally, it was Sha Hualing who stored people in cages for him to pick from as he pleased. No explicit orders needed. Luo Binghe simply needed to deploy Xing Mo's sword to cleave open a passage to the demon realm on the night of the full moon and grab somebody to use. The sad thing was that in the original work, Sha Hualing had gone to all that effort, but then Luo Binghe had gotten together with 3 beautiful nuns from Tianyi Temple, victims she had personally selected. As one might imagine, Sha Hualing nearly went mad with anger. While you were captured, did you see anyone else? Shen Qingqiu asked. Where were you held? Yang Yixuan shook his head. As soon as we entered the rift between realms, we were in the lair of the demon woman, Zhiyun Cave. I was shut in the single-person cell and didn't see anyone else. Shen Qingqiu tossed and caught Liu Mingyan's sword tassel several times. My guess is that you weren't the only one captured, he said. He thought for a moment, then decided to go take a look. In any case, tonight wasn't the full moon, so it wasn't time for the extraction. Luo Binghe would be away, busy stirring up havoc and inciting chaos in the human realm, so he probably wouldn't come looking to meet with Sha Hualing. And saving Liu Mingyan, who shouldn't have appeared here in the first place, wouldn't count as messing up the plot. Rather, he'd be correcting it. Yang Yixuan hurried to catch up. I'll come too. My sword is still in that demon woman's hands. You're not scared she'll take off her clothes? Asked Shen Qingqiu. There's no way I'll be scared, Yang Yixuan said disdainfully. Besides, throughout the entire trip, she took them off dozens of times. There's nothing remarkable about it anymore. Shen Qingqiu turned around, speechless. So the reason she shut you in a single-person cell was actually so she could strip for your eyes only. What an unbelievable bonus! Young man, if you continued at this pace, you'll definitely die to the male lead. How worrisome! You're Liu Qingge's sole disciple. Passing through the spatial rift was like passing through a gushing flow of warm water. Once they re-emerged, they were in the demon territory. On the human side, it was already past midnight, but on the demon side, twilight had only just fallen. The air was particularly arid. After standing there a moment, Shen Qingqiu grew a bit dizzy, like he was suffering from altitude sickness. As far as the eye could see, there seemed to be little difference from the human realm, although the trees were a tad sparser. Looked like their greenification efforts were a bit lacking. Yang Yixuan led the way. They passed through craggy stones and soon found the opening of Zhiyun Cave. It's an honor to see you at last, oh cultural monument of the demon race. Seeing it in person, Shen Qingqiu found that, sure enough, it was unique. It was the demon race's nature to prefer darkness. Most of their permanent and temporary residences were located wholly underground. When he took in the entire entrance, it seemed to him to be an exceptionally splendid mausoleum. Ooh, a tablet inscribed with 3 characters in twisty red calligraphy erected in front of a big pile of rocks. Tell me, what could that be if not a tombstone? Shen Qingqiu thought. He cupped a handful of spiritual energy, ready at all times to make a mess of any enemy who might show their face. But after he started down the tomb passage, no, the cave entrance. Not once did he see any guards. When he thought about it, it made sense. Only demons had ever sneaked into the human realm to throw their weight around. What humans would suicidally run over to this side? The demons had absolutely no need to arrange for guards. The pair stealthily moved deeper. After passing through the stone corridors, they arrived at a large hall. The hall was carpeted with intact skins of all manner of strange beasts. At first glance, they seemed to be still alive. Sha Hualing was currently barefoot, pacing back and forth on an enormous tiger skin spread over the floor of the hall. Shen Qingqiu was worried that Yang Yixuan would recklessly make a sound and alert her. Just as he was about to remind him to shush, he saw that the child had sensibly shut his mouth. Reassured, he turned back around. On both sides of the hall were numerous cages, each holding tightly bound cultivators in differently colored uniforms. Some looked awfully young, but he also saw veterans. Some were drowsily nodding off, and others were glowering in fury. Sha Hualing walked over to one of the cages, arms crossed. "You people from Changqiu Mountain Sect really are bothersome and annoying. Capturing 2 of you took so much effort, and one even escaped before he could be shut away." She clenched her teeth. If not for, I'm really itching to break all of your legs." In this cage, Liu Mingyan sat with her veil covering her face, her eyes closed and her legs crossed, impervious to outside matters. Sha Hualing saw that she was being ignored and smiled coldly. "That thing on your face, don't you ever want to take it off? Oh, I see. Could it be that your face is so ugly that you dare not to take it off out of shame?" "Girl, do you know who you'll envy the most in the future? Saying she's ugly is just you giving yourself a thorough slap in the face." Sha Hualing's woman's intuition was acting up. No matter how she looked at Liu Mingyan, the cultivator irritated her from every angle. She opened the cage, dragged Liu Mingyan out, and yelled, "Kneel!" Liu Mingyan was naturally unwilling to do so. Though she was thoroughly without spiritual energy, she still stood firm. Sha Hualing pushed and shoved, but she was utterly unable to make Liu Mingyan's knees bend even a little. Enraged to the point that steam came out of her ears, she snatched the veil off of Liu Mingyan's face. In that moment, Sha Hualing's delicate snow-pale face became even more snow-pale. Turn around, I want to see!" Shen Qingqiu howled internally. "Quickly, let me see what the most beautiful woman in this book looks like." All these years, he'd been mindful of his status, so he couldn't have just said, "Hey, Marshall niece, I heard that you're super pretty, so I wanted to have a look at your face. May I?" That sounded like something a pervert would say when sexually harassing someone. But having spent so long unable to see Liu Mingyan's face, he felt like he was about to burst. However, before Liu Mingyan could turn and let him experience the joy of a first glance, malice flashed through Sha Hualing's eyes. Her fingers curved into claws and shot towards Liu Mingyan's face. And thus, for the second time that night, Sha Hualing was sent flying, and she was finally unable to stop herself from coughing up a sullen mouthful of blood. A dash of self-consolation flashed through her mind. At least my clothes weren't damaged this time. I won't need to change again, right? Although Shen Qingqiu had sent her flying, she'd still clawed 5 gashes into his sleeve. Wait, didn't I trim those fingernails an hour ago? He thought, shocked. Are they capable of unlimited regeneration? After tossing Sha Hualing away, he promptly turned his head to look at Liu Mingyan, and as soon as he did, his feet slipped out from under him. In the blink of an eye, she'd instantly put her veil back on. What's wrong with letting me have a glance? Yang Yixuan had found his sword stabbed into a seam in the rocks, and he had already started hacking at the chains on the cage doors with matchless speed. A throng of cultivators swarmed out with each chop. Then Shen Qingqiu saw 3 navy blue silhouettes out of the corner of his eye and said with great alarm, "Stop, stop! Don't do anything impulsive!" Confused, Yang Yixuan turned his head. "Is something wrong, senior?" The words had barely left his mouth when Shen Qingqiu realized that he'd already opened the cage at hand, and the 3 dainty Taoist nuns with faces that could have been cast from the same mold rushed out of Chiyun Cave like a trio of whirlwinds. "Buddy, by haphazardly releasing everyone like this, you've released some people who shouldn't have left." He had released the 3 sisters responsible for settling Luo Binghe's demonic qi in the long term. But that blunder had already occurred. Shen Qingqiu's heart flooded with tears. But it wasn't like he could run after the nuns and stuff them back into their cages. There was no other option. He could only join in releasing people. As he freed them, he sighed and lamented. He was dead. He'd managed to totally ruin a plot thread. The first meeting between the male lead and 3 members of his harem. A freak accident had messed up the scenario in which they fooled around and cultivated together. He could only place his hope in that hard-working employee, Sha Hualing, who would bravely go back to war and ideally recapture them to present to Luo Binghe. It was criminal, criminal! Shen Qingqiu was still wallowing in remorse when he lowered his head and unexpectedly found himself looking at a familiar face. His heart thumped. Fuck. It truly was an unlucky year. His enemies kept marching down that narrow road. Qiu Haitang was huddled in the cage, staring at him with a bewildered expression. Shen Qingqiu was stupefied for a couple of seconds, then feigned ignorance. He motioned for her to hurry out, then nonchalantly turned around. With his current appearance, no one should have recognized him. Moreover, 5 years ago, countless pairs of eyes had witnessed the scene of Shen Qingqiu's self-detonation. There was nothing to worry about. After coughing up blood, Sha Hualing remained sprawled on the floor in a daze for a while, then finally struggled into a seated position with great difficulty. She focused her gaze and yelled, "It's you! Who the hell are you? You actually dared to follow me here? You sure have some guts." Yang Yixuan looked like it had suddenly occurred to him to ask this question as well. So as he was setting people free, he asked offhandedly, "All right, senior, who are you?" "Oh, right, my ass! Young man, your reaction time is way too slow. Also, what's with that tone? Like you're asking something tangential and unimportant." Shen Qingqiu was considering whether to introduce himself with the title of Peerless Cucumber again, when Sha Hualing humphed out a laugh. "Whatever, you've come this far, so don't imagine I'll allow you to leave." She clapped her hands, bells jingling around her wrists. After a moment, Chiyun Cave's guard regiment finally flooded into the hall from every corner. Chiyun Cave was Sha Hualing's private residence, so her regular underlings weren't around, and these useless troops were nothing to fear. Those minor demons circled around and around them, raising and lowering their arms, looking exactly like they were performing some kind of backwater dance ritual. Shen Qingqiu was mystified by the sight, but he was impatient, so he prepared to send them all flying with his fan when, to his surprise, it seemed like countless strands of hair had fallen all over him, constraining his movements. Immortal binding cables. Even though these motley troops didn't have much fighting ability, they were obviously trained. Each held a hair-thin immortal binding cable, and they circled him non-stop, winding him into a giant ball of string until he was fully entwined. Sha Hualing hadn't managed to cheer in victory before Shen Qingqiu laughed, then violently stomped on the floor, the air filled with the sound of snapping strings. They had burst. The immortal binding cable had been thoroughly snapped by this person who flooded them with spiritual energy. More or less everyone there was so terrified they completely forgot the task at hand. This really was the first time they had seen someone who could use spiritual energy to simply snap immortal binding cables. What a straightforward and brutal method of freeing oneself! "Just run!" Shen Qingqiu yelled. The freed cultivators didn't need additional encouragement. Most of them were already long gone. Yang Yixuan and Liu Mingyan had just struggled free of their immortal binding cables, and the circulation of their spiritual qi was still unstable. Knowing that they would only get in the way if they stayed, and seeing that Shen Qingqiu would likely be able to handle things, they retreated, leaving with only a "Senior, take care." The underlings didn't know whether to chase them and remained stuck in place, waiting for their superior's orders. Sha Hualing pointed at Shen Qingqiu, a strange gleam in her eye. "Catch him!" she shouted. "Don't worry about the others, just him! Hold him down, even if you die trying!" A few hodgepodge soldiers threw themselves at Shen Qingqiu, and he sent them flying with his fan. Then something heavy pressed down on his head. A giant net. Countless immortal binding cables, each the thickness of a pinky finger, had been woven into a giant net which was draping down upon his head. When it settled over Shen Qingqiu, its weight alone forced his knees to fold, and he nearly fell flat on the ground. "Where did you get this kind of bizarre prop? With cables this thick, are you sure it's for binding immortals? Maybe you mean elephants?" Sha Hualing waited a while, and only after seeing that Shen Qingqiu was indeed unable to struggle free this time, she lazily approached. Her previously wretched state had been swept tidily away. Sha Hualing felt that she had completed a momentous task and was wholly content. Even her reprimands took on a coquettish tone. "If 100 immortal binding cables can't hold you down, then why wouldn't I use 1,000 or 10,000? She chuckled. "This immortal binding net wasn't originally prepared for you, and yet it was used on you, so you should feel supremely honored. Don't flail about. As long as you behave, I won't do anything to you." "If you won't do anything to me, can I trouble you to withdraw this net?" asked Shen Qingqiu. But the demon racer's star employee Sha Hualing had jumped right back into her grand missionary sales pitch. "It seems that you were blessed with extraordinary talent," she said as she crouched down, though she was speaking mainly to herself. "If you were to surrender and pledge yourself to be my people's banner, power and glory would be within your grasp. Of course, even if you won't pledge yourself, it doesn't matter. What should be done must be done. Some suffering will be unavoidable. You should consider this carefully." No wonder Sha Hualing had ignored the others fleeing the cave and concentrated all her firepower on him. Luo Binghe needed spiritually powerful human vessels, abundant in spiritual energy. Of all the cultivators she had captured, none could have been more powerful than Shen Qingqiu. So this brat was planning to offer him to Luo Binghe as a human vessel. Releasing the 3 beautiful flowers had been a purely unthinkable mistake. Shen Qingqiu had certainly never planned to fill in the gap they had left behind himself. He had that old feeling of having accidentally picked up the wrong script. It made him vaguely suspicious that the scam of a system was still around. Shen Qingqiu was just thinking of some escape plans when Sha Hualing fixed her slightly messy hair and with a swing of her hips, forged ahead out of the hall. From a distance, Shen Qingqiu heard the sound of her soft and delicate laughter. my lord! Ah, it isn't the night of the full moon. Why did you think to visit the subordinate? Although you came at just the right time, as it turns out, I've prepared a special gift for you. It's right in here. In a split second, a flood of hot blood mixed with cold sweat surged into Shen Jingqiu's head. He didn't know where he had found this burst of explosive power, but he grabbed the side of the net and sent a bottomless pool of spiritual qi in his body outward in the form of a spiritual blast. Bang! A giant boom sounded. Sha Hualing's smile became fixed on her face. She sprinted back to the inner hall in a panic and was left staring tongue-tied at the sight. In the middle of the hall, every last one of Chi Yun Cave's minor demons laid sprawled in every which way all over the ground. In the center of the immortal binding net, there was an immense hole, its edges still sizzling with flashing sparks, and wisps of white smoke drifted through the air. That man was, in a word, terrifying. He'd rent a devastatingly large hole in the specially made immortal binding net, and he was gone. The person behind Sha Hualing passed her and strolled into the hall. Chi Yun Cave was lightless and dim. Only his straight and slender silhouette was visible, along with the subtle silver light reflecting off of the embroidered patterns on his black robes. After a moment, Lord Binghe spoke with a tone that was neither pleased nor angry. "And this is your special gift." "Due to a momentary miscalculation, I let him get away," Sha Hualing said bitterly. Her distressed heart was dripping blood. An immortal binding net woven from thousands of immortal binding cables, originally meant to be used on those stinking cultivators from Changqiu Mountain sect, had been torn open with a massive hole just like that. This wasn't something she could just sew and patch with a needle, then go back to using it like it was nothing. Lord Binghe's back was facing her. He lowered his head and looked over the wreckage as he said icily, "I seemed to recall telling you that people from Changqiu Mountain sect were off limits." Drops of cold sweat dripped down Sha Hualing's forehead. Lord Binghe had indeed told her this. However, the spiritual energy levels of Changqiu Mountain sect's disciples were generally much higher than those of other sects' disciples by a good margin, and so they were the most suitable human vessels for extraction. Clinging to wishful thinking, she just captured a few, thinking that maybe she could switch their clothes and slip them into the collection undetected. She hadn't expected that Lord Binghe would somehow still be able to tell who she'd captured, even after they'd all fled. Internally, she couldn't help but feel her blood freeze over. "Don't be angry, my lord," she said hurriedly. "I accidentally captured 2 of them, but I released them right after. Rather this time, this subordinate found someone exceptional. I've never seen a cultivator with more abundant spiritual energy. If you had that one person, you no longer need to switch to a new vessel every month." She bit her lip and added, "As long as you give me a certain thing." After waiting for a moment, she suddenly extended her hand to catch the object tossed her way. Securely clutching it in her palm, she smiled, determined.